The next speaker, as I've just mentioned, is Clifford Goldstein. He comes to us from the General Conference. He is the editor of the Sabbath School Quarterlies, which I'm sure each one of you studies week in and week out. So I'd like to invite him to the stage at this time.
How's that? Yeah, okay. All right, let's rewind. Okay. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov, he has a scene in the novel which goes on for about 300 pages of two guys sitting in a restaurant eating and talking, and Dostoevsky's probably the only writer in the world that can have 200 pages of two guys sitting in a restaurant eating and talking and pulling it off and making it work brilliantly. And in it, there are these two brothers. One's a monk and the other one's a socialist. And the socialist is arguing with his brother why he cannot believe in God. Why he, just because of all the evil in the world, why there can't be a God. And he tells a story. He tells a story about, because remember, this is Russia in the 1800s, so that's the background. And he tells about some wealthy landowner who's got all these serfs living on the property. And one day the owner goes out and he notices that his dog, his favorite dog, was lame. His paw was injured. And he asked what happened, and they said a little serf boy, threw a rock accidentally and injured the dog's leg. Well, the owner in the story, whether it's true or not, I don't know, it probably was based on something, has the little boy stripped down naked, and in front of his mother has the boy run and sets the dogs on the boy, and the dogs in front of the mother just rip the kid apart right in front of the mother's eyes. Now, Ivan's purpose to tell that story, and he told the story of how the Bulgarians, in one of the endless wars they've had in that part of the world, how the Bulgarians would come and they'd take little babies and they'd throw them up in the air and they'd catch them on the end of their bayonets. Or he told stories about how these Russian parents had abused their little girl and they make her eat excrement, human excrement, and they'd lock her in a basement all night and just constantly just tormented this girl. And he asked these and his other questions, but it all boiled down to the simple question, how could these incidents and an endless number I just got done reading a bunch of books recently. I read a book about the Russian Revolution. I recently read a book about the Spanish Revolution. I just finished reading about the rape of Nanking, and then I read a biography of Mao Zedong, and the endless killing, and on and on and on. The numbers boggle your mind. The torture boggles your mind. The question is, that Ivan asks is, how could this ever be justified, even at the end of the age when some divine harmony is to be restored, when all the insufferable questions are to be answered and resolved, and when all of God's ways are going to be vindicated before men and angels. And here's how Dostoevsky puts the question in Ivan Karamazov's mouth. I want to see with my own eyes, thundered Ivan, the hind lie down with the lion, and the victim rise up with them and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly understands what it has all been for. But then there are the children, and what am I to do about them? That's a question I cannot answer. I for the 100th time, I repeat, there are numbers of questions, but I've taken only the children, because in their case, what I mean is so unanswerably clear. If all must pay for the eternal harmony, what have the children to do with it? Tell me, please. And see, this point, though a lot of people can't express it with the kind of grace that Dostoevsky did with Ivan, the basic question is, this is a question that I think bothers, everybody, particularly those of us who believe in God, believe in a loving God. The children, suffering is bad enough, but all the children suffer as well? I mean, that's a hard enough problem. It's not something that so much is a problem for atheists or for skeptics. Not that it doesn't bother these people. It probably bothers them more than maybe even Christians, because we live with the hope that there's some kind of answer. These people live in this world without believing in God, without believing in any kind of ultimate justice, and they just, they think, well, that's just the way it is. There's no explanation, there's no meaning. This is just what it means to live in a godless, atheist world, in a universe that never saw us coming, doesn't care if we're here, and is going to swallow us up one day as if we'd never been here. Anyway, it's not such a big issue for them, at least not philosophically. But no, the question, the children, what am I to do about them, presents a little more problems for those of us who believe in God. Children ripped apart by hunting dogs, or parents who torture their own children. These fit pretty well in an atheistic, godless, meaningless, chance universe that Jeff talked about. No meaning behind it. It's the Christian worldview, with their idea of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, that really these questions present a problem. These issues, these facts present a problem. I go to, what time? To 11:30. Oh, okay. All right. I might even get done earlier than that. Okay. Here's a quote that a guy asked in the 3rd century BC. This isn't anything new. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Asked Epicurus, Greek, in the 3rd century BC. Is God willing to prevent evil but unable? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from where cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Okay? So these are the basic questions that I think reasonable people have about pain and suffering. I mean, it just doesn't end, does it? It just doesn't end. I don't have to go read the newspaper. I at the GC, people, what their kids go through, what their families go through, it just doesn't think. It's one blankety blank thing after another, to quote a philosopher. Right? Now, there really are many good logical arguments for the existence of God. I mean, Jeff pretty much stole my thunder with what he did. But those are logically, the moral argument for the existence of God. Let me try, he basically explained it. Let me try another way. Let's take one that's close to me. I'm a Jew. I'm obsessed with the Holocaust, okay? That's, my religion growing up was the Holocaust. I couldn't name you the 10 Commandments, but I could name you every death camp in Europe and how many Jews they murdered in it. Let's just assume, see, there are two options. Morality is either a human creation or it's a divine creation. It's created by us or it's created by a transcendent being, God, whatever you want to call it, okay? It's one or the other. Well, let's just take the atheist view, let's just take the view that morality is a human creation. Okay, a lot of people believe that. So now let's go hypothetically. Let's say the Nazis won the war. Let's say they won the war and they took over the world, the whole world, and with their immense propaganda machine. Suppose they had convinced every human being on the earth that it was a moral obligation that every Jewish person, 1/4 Jew, if you had one grandparent Jewish, you were considered Jewish and to be exterminated. Now, let's assume that they won the war, and the propaganda machine went all over the world, and let's say, very effective propaganda. I mean, look at what they did to the Germans, and how they brainwashed the Germans. Let's just say then that every human being in the world were convinced that every Jew, man, woman, and child had to be murdered. Okay, if everybody believed it, then would it be right? Would it be right if everybody believed it? Now, if you're a little bit uncomfortable with that, but why? Why? If morality is totally a human construct, if we create morality the way we create music, the way we create art, the way we create whatever things that are purely human creations, then there is absolutely no logical reason why it would be morally wrong to murder every Jewish man, woman, and child if everybody in the world believes it. Now, there are a lot of people, most people, are not comfortable with that. And I would say that then why not? If morality is only a human construct, well, then the answer I would give is, well, because morality, the ultimate origins of morality transcend humans, transcend human culture, transcend society and ideas and human stuff. And where else would that come from but from God? And for many people, that argument is fairly powerful argument for the existence of God. Now, as Jeff also mentioned, the cosmological argument. And that's basically, there's really only two kinds of existence. If you could think of a third, please let me know. There's only two kinds. There was what was created. There was what once did not exist and then comes into existence. And then there's that which was always created, that which was something that always existed, never had a beginning, never had an end. Okay, it always was there. As I said, try to think of a third. Okay, and everything in the universe we know comes, nothing comes from itself. Everything, nothing originates from itself. So how can anything ultimately come from nothing? So either you have something that always existed, or you've got something that was created, that once didn't exist and was created. And for many people, what always existed, the universe we now believe was created. The Big Bang Theory that really kind of threw people off for up until this century. Most people believe the universe was always eternal, which, as Jeff pointed out, does present certain philosophical problems. If it always existed, how did you get from that far back in eternity to the present moment, which is difficult. But again, the bottom line is, in many ways, it's very logical to think that the universe that's here, that nothing came from itself, that the universe is not self-explanatory, that something outside the universe, greater than the universe, created the universe. And for many people, that's, what else would that be but God? And then, finally, there's basically the teleological argument, as he said, the argument from design and purpose, which, very powerful. In fact, it was interesting. I remember a number of years ago, I was reading a book, a debate between atheists and secularists, between atheists and theists on the existence of God. And I'm reading this one atheist, and this guy's brilliant. this guy's brilliant. I mean, now those kind of arguments don't bother me because I don't believe you come to a knowledge of God through logic and reason anyway. You know, you could come to believe in the existence through logic and reason, but the knowledge of God, that's not going to work. So I'm reading this atheist, and I just love his arguments. I said, this guy is powerful. And I said, who is this guy? And his name was Anthony Flew. And I think he's a Brit. Oh, no, yeah, he was Brit. He was born in England, then he worked in Canada for a long time. But anyway, just a while back, and if you ever get a chance to pick it up, about 2 months ago, I was in a bookstore, and I picked up a book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And it was Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew, called There Is a God. Anthony Flew. It's worth reading, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And one of the things that convinced him was just the argument from design. He just looked around at the complexity of design, and he said some divine mind, he said, had to create the world. He just said, here was a guy who spent 50 years, one of the most, I'm telling you, he was brilliant. Flew stuff was good if you're an atheist. I mean, he was really very powerful. I mean, just as good as those arguments go. The arguments for God and against God are as good as far as they go. None of them lock it down, can totally lock it up. So anyway, you got these arguments for God, and I believe, contrary to what people think, I think the logic and reason and arguments for the existence of God far outweigh the logic and reason and arguments against the existence of God. All that being said, though, these arguments, cosmological, moral, teleological argument, as good as they are to itself, none of them prove, quote, proof, and that's a whole long philosophical thing you can get into. What does it mean to prove? Prove anything. I have a whole talk I give on you can't really prove 1 + 1 = 2. It's really more of a faith statement than you realize. But none of these prove the existence of God. All of them together don't prove the existence of God, no matter how much evidence they give. Yet these arguments, I said they're good as far as they go, which isn't, as I said, isn't far enough, because if they did, there would never be any question. But instead, these arguments show how logical and reasonable it is to believe in a God. Yet, however logical, however reasonable, however good these arguments are, however strong of an edifice, a rational edifice they can build for belief in God, what they don't do, either separately or together, and they don't touch it in any way, shape, or form, is they don't come near to answering Ivan Karamazov's question. The children, what am I to do about them? See the point? However logical and however reasonable those proofs are, they are no more logical, they are no more reasonable than the question of how could an all-powerful, all-good, all-loving God, exist in a world where their children are tortured by their parents, they're ripped apart by hunting dogs, where they're gassed at Auschwitz, mothers and children gassed at Auschwitz, and on and on and on. Here's a Scottish philosopher. If God is perfectly loving, wrote Scottish philosopher John Hick, he must wish to abolish evil. And if he is all-powerful, he must be able to abolish evil. But evil exists. Therefore, God cannot be both omnipotent and perfectly loving. Okay, that's the gist of the argument. And it's logical. I mean, it's not an unreasonable question to ask. But evil exists, therefore God cannot be both omnipotent and perfectly loving. Unless, though, you've got to come into understanding, though, and here's where you can get into some heavy philosophical waters, and I'm going to try to keep it simple because That's basically the only way I understand it. If I keep it simple, I can understand it. See, it comes down, though, to what do you mean by omnipotence? What does omnipotence mean? Does it mean you can do absolutely everything? Think about that for a minute. Can omnipotence create a triangle that has 4 sides? Can omnipotence create a triangle that has 4 sides? But I mean, why not? I mean, you can do anything. But the moment that a triangle has 4 sides, it ceases to be a triangle. Okay? Can omnipotence create a circle? Could omnipotence create a circle that has 4 right angles, 90-degree angles at its edges? Again, no. Because the moment it has those 4 right angles, it's no longer a circle. Can omnipotence create a positive whole number that is less than 0? I mean, can't omnipotence do everything? A positive whole integer that is less than 0. No, because the moment it's less than 0, it's not a positive whole number. And can 2 plus 2, can omnipotence make 2 plus 2 equal 5? Again, the moment it's 2 plus 2, the moment it's 5, it's no longer 2 plus 2. Now, here's the question. Can omnipotence create a love that is forced? See, this comes down to what I think. Can God create a love that is forced? Just as a triangle, to be a triangle, has to have 3 sides. Love, to be love, has to be freely given, or it's not love at all. I mean, to force love is to annihilate it. It's like a proton and an antiproton meeting. They meet each other and they instantly are annihilated. Love, by its very definition as love, has to be freely given. If it's not freely given, it's no longer love. Even God, the Almighty Creator, He cannot force love. The moment you force love, it's something other than love. Can you see that point there? This is fundamental. Love to be free, love to be love, has to be freely given, or it's not love. Love without freedom is as impossible as almost like a Euclidean plane without width or without breadth. See, God can create obedience without freedom. Oh, He can create obedience without freedom. You know, He can create law without freedom. He can create order without freedom. He can create compliance without freedom, but not love. God can force the whole universe to worship Him. He can force the whole universe to obey Him. He can force the whole universe to fear Him. But He can't force a single creature in the universe to love Him. Can you see the point there? The moment you force love, it's no longer love. And here's the pivot point on which we start getting some answers. The only way God could create beings to love Him is if He created them free moral beings. We had to have this moral freedom. We really couldn't be moral at all. I could program a computer. I could program a computer to help little old ladies cross the street. I can program a computer to catch burglars who are trying to break into my property. I can program a computer to do a lot of, quote, moral things. But would you say that the computer itself was a moral entity? Of course not. There was no morality in it. See, we have, without the potential for immorality, without the potential even for evil, humans are not morally free. And if we're not morally free, we don't have the capacity to truly love. Can you see the point there? Love is a moral choice. It's a moral question. It has to exist in a moral universe. And if you don't have that, you can't have love. Again, you could have compliance. I remember reading a fiction story, a scientific story one time. I don't usually read that stuff. But somehow somebody turned me on to this book, and a guy created a robot. His wife had died. And he was in the future, and he created a robot. The woman was just like his wife. Everything, you couldn't tell the difference. Acted just like his wife, felt like his wife. Everything was just like his wife. But it was programmed robot. And eventually, he just sent her away because it just wasn't. It wasn't real. It wasn't real love. Love means something only when you have the capacity not to love. Can you see what I'm saying? If you're forced to love someone, it doesn't mean anything. The power of love becomes only because it's free choice. It's fundamental to it. It's axiomatic to it. You can't have love without freedom anymore. You can have, well, as I said, you can't have Euclidean space without breadth, without length, and without width. You know, moral freedom doesn't demand that wrong choices be made. That's a whole different thing. It doesn't demand that wrong choices be made. It only means that there is a potential environment, that there's a moral atmosphere where if you want to not love, you have the option not to love. Otherwise, whatever, quote, love you have isn't really love. You know, think about this for a minute. I mean, look at Lucifer. Lucifer was in a perfect environment. We're talking heaven. We're talking heaven. And he was a perfect being. He was a perfect being in a perfect environment created by a perfect God. Capiche? And then what happened? How did he fall? How did he fall? Because that perfect environment by a perfect God who created a perfect being, it obviously included the potential for this, because God wanted Lucifer to love him. And the only way you could love is if you have an environment of this moral freedom. Adam and Eve. God saw all that he made. It was tov meod. Very good. They were perfect beings created by a perfect God in a perfect moral environment. And what happened? They fell. Because love, in order for it to be love, in order for them to love God, they had to have this moral freedom. Okay, fair enough. You say, let's go to this, let's look at it this point. In a sense then, God had no choice. If he wanted beings to love him, he had to create them free. Okay? Can you follow me that far? If God wanted beings, even an almighty, all-powerful God can't force love. He had to create freedom in order for beings to love him. Okay, this leads, though, now to the next logical question. Why did God create these free and moral beings if he knew not only that they were going to have that they had to have the potential for evil, but that eventually they would choose evil and they would fall and we would be in this mess? Again, in order for God to create free beings, logic demanded for beings to love him, logic demanded that he had to create them free. But what logic demanded that he had to create us? You see what I'm saying? Why did he create us? If he didn't have to create us, I know of no logical contradiction that would occur if human beings didn't exist. I mean, I think the universe existed a long time before we were here. It did fine, thank you. So it's not like there's some inherent logical contradiction for our not being here. So God created us. He created us so then when he didn't have to. Then an all-omnipotent, all-knowing being created us when he didn't have to. And so he created us despite his foreknowledge that we would choose evil. And then he created us anyway. Now, how do we reconcile that? He had no choice. If he wanted beings to love him, he had to create them free. So he created free beings knowing that we would do evil. How do we reconcile that? Well, if we believe that God is all-loving, we have to believe that in the end, God, knowing what would happen, would ultimately bring out what is called the greater good. Okay? Ultimately, in the end, if knowing that the free beings he would create would choose evil, and evil would bring out suffering, and God created those beings anyway, and if God is all good and all loving, then he must have created those beings with the knowledge that despite the evil, despite the suffering, despite all this bad that happens, that ultimately, when it's in the big picture, when it's all said and done, a greater good is going to come out of it, no matter how difficult it is for us now or for Ivan Karamazov in the book to see. Okay? That makes sense? Ultimately, he's an all-loving God, created us knowing this was going to happen. He's ultimately going to bring out a greater good. So here's where we are. God had no choice. If he wanted beings to love him, he had to create them free. God didn't have to create us, but he did so anyway, knowing what was going to happen, knowing the fall was going to come. But if he's an all-loving, all-good God, we have to ultimately believe that he's going to bring out a greater good from it. Okay, that's all fine. But now it leads to what's in many ways the most difficult question of all in this whole spiel. If there is a greater good, and all of God's ways are going to be exonerated in some grand and final harmony that vindicates God and answers these questions. That's all fine. The tough question is, how can God justify working it out here in the dirt, in human blood, sweat, and tears, in the children, as Dostoevsky said, while he sits enthroned in heaven? See what I'm saying? Whatever the profound questions, whatever the tough things that we're dealing with, whatever the great moral struggles between good and evil in the great controversy, however efficiently and permanently all these questions we're told are going to be answered, that's fine and that's great, but the question is, why should an omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving God be safely ensconced somewhere up in the sky while all us poor schnooks down here deal with poverty, deal with crime, deal with hunger, disease, and war and violence, and all the rest? That's the tough question. It's all going to work out fine, that's great, but God's up in heaven. God's up in heaven, and Well, we're down here again. God, to create beings who love Him, He had to create them free. He created us free when He didn't have to. He did it ultimately knowing He's going to bring out a greater good. But okay, that's fine, a greater good, but we're the poor schnooks down here, groveling in the dirt, not knowing what's going to happen from the next. We're the one with all this suffering going on and this great controversy. How do you justify that? And there's really only one answer to it. Now, before I get to it, though, I want to shift gears a little bit. It's funny, I have an uncle who's a novelist, who's a writer, and runs in my family. He's a hardcore atheist. He's a hardcore atheist. And the reason I'm telling this is kind of ironic, because he wrote a book. He writes experimental fiction. And in the book, of all people, he quoted Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you know the name Nietzsche, Nietzsche was probably one of the most influential atheists of the past century. Every time in America some kid goes nuts and takes a machine gun and shoots up the school or something, they always blame it on Nietzsche, and then Nietzsche gets the blame for all this stuff, which I think it's somewhat of a twisting of what Nietzsche wrote. But Nietzsche's a hardcore atheist. And in the book, my uncle quotes Nietzsche. And I read that quote, and that quote did more to help resolve in my mind the question of evil than anything else in my... I became an Adventist in '80, so I've been around 28 years now. That has done more. And I'm going to read you the quote, and when I first read you the quote, you're going to scratch your head, and you're going to think, what in the world is this guy talking about? But let me parse it through with you, because I have found it exceedingly helpful in what is continually a difficult question. People, we could love God, believe in God, utterly sure that God exists, willing to burn at the stake for God, but there's always that tough question of evil. In fact, I said to somebody the other day, because I found out something happened to somebody and I just couldn't understand it. And I said, if I hadn't from myself, numerous times have experienced for myself the existence of God and the love of God and known it, no matter, know it, no more if I know anything else, I could understand why people wouldn't believe there was a God. I'm just so thankful for that experience of knowing God for myself so I can know the Lord, even though a lot of these things happen that just absolutely make no sense. But anyway, the question, I got another one of these somewhere. I definitely need to wet my whistle up here. Okay, what is the quote? This is the quote from Nietzsche. In the end, Nietzsche said, one experiences only one's self. This is you expected some deep, profound thing that can bring the walls down. In the end, one experiences only one's self. Now think about this, because he's right. When we grieve with those who are grieving, when we weep with those who are weeping, when we suffer with those who are suffering, we experience we experience only our own grief, only our own suffering, only our own sorrow. We can't bleed anybody else's blood. We can't secrete any sweat but our own, no matter how closely tied we are with someone, no matter how fused we are emotionally, mentally, physically. In the end, all we know is our own pain. Other people's pain comes filtered to us only through our own. I remember when Bill Clinton, who was my favorite president, by the way, you can't believe what a disaster. Well, you live over here. England, I know what you think of George Bush. You don't think of him half as bad as I do, but Don't get me off on that. But Clinton once said, I feel your pain. Well, I was shocked because Bill Clinton lied. Okay? You don't feel anyone's pain. And whether a mother holding a feverish infant to her breast, or a husband holding a dying wife in his arms, you can't feel a prick of their pain. You don't feel a spasm of their woe. You can't splice into someone can be up here dying, and you can hold them, and you can't splice into their bodies. You can't somehow splice your nerves into them and feel anything of what they feel. You feel your own pain, your own suffering, and you can feel sorry for them, and you can weep with them, and so on and so forth. But in the end, it's only your own pain. It's only your own suffering. Pain is more private than thought. Thoughts can be shared. Pain never can. Unlike the liver, unlike the heart, unlike, blood, none of it's transferable. You can't give somebody else's what's yours, and yours alone is yours alone. You think when famine descended upon Ethiopia, when tons of this flesh just withered back into the earth, they did so one quivering ounce at a time, each person feeling their own pain. However we suffer, however we die, whether in bunches or alone, pain, corporate agony, collective pain, it does not exist. We're islands of anguish unto ourselves. Now, in a sense, this privatization of pain, this is very good. It's because no one has ever suffered more than an individual can. Grief always remains finite, always remains hedged in by what's limited and as fleeting as us as human beings. We know no more pain than our personal metabolism allows. You reach a certain point, no more pain than our delirious cells can carry. Sooner or later, at a point, you reach a point where it gets too much, and then you'll just die. But the point is, it's that nobody has suffered anybody else's pain. All human suffering. I think of the Holocaust. I think of all those people murdered in mass. And yet, whether they were stuffed in a gas chamber and murdered together, or taken out individually and shot, or anybody anywhere, our pain is always limited. It's no human being on this earth has ever suffered more than a single individual can suffer. Can you see the point? It's limited purely by our individuality, our finitude as human beings. There is, though, just one exception. Okay? There is, though, one exception. And this happened. Let me read you the text. It's just just a few words here. This is Isaiah 53:4. Akain holayenu hunasa umakovenu savalam. Akain holayenu hunasa. Therefore our holayenu, our sufferings. Now the Hebrew word there, holy, the literal word there, the King James, I'm a King James fan. When I read the English Bible, I read the King James. I don't mind that he was gay, but I like the King James Bible anyway. Okay? I don't know how to dig that in, because these King James fanatics, I love to dig that in, But he bore our sufferings, our sickness. Whose sufferings? Whose sickness? Our sufferings, our sicknesses. He bore our suffering and sickness. Umakovenu Makovenu, and that's a very strong word for pain. For pain. Makovenu, our suvalam, he carried it. He bore our pain. He bore our suffering. Think about it. Where does all our pain, all our suffering, what has it all originated from? It all originated from sin. All this originated from sin. And what I'm saying is, at the cross, the God who created the universe, because Jesus was the God who created everything, the God who created human beings, who created a free moral environment, who created them with the capacity to love, who created them with the option to not love if they chose. At the cross, the power who created all the universe, he stood there, was there in human form, and all the suffering, all the pain, all the grief and sorrow of the world, he bore our griefs and he carried our sorrows. Whose is that? That's of every human being. Can you see the point? So what we know only as individuals. You can never know any more pain than you only as an individual can know. Now, it can be pretty miserable. I'm not denying how pretty miserable life can be and how great our pain could be. But I'm saying at the cross, as it said, he bore our holayenu, or holy, our sufferings, makovenu, our sorrows, our pains. That's all of us. It all fell on Jesus at once at the cross. And ultimately, and I don't know the metaphysics of how that all works, but ultimately it was enough to crush out the life of the Son of God. Though we experience only our own pain and only our own suffering, at the cross, Jesus experienced everyone else's. The misery and woe that we see in the whole world, all as a result of sin, it all came crashing down on God in the person of Jesus on the cross at Calvary. You know, Ellen White in one place said, I got to get the reference here, I forgot, she's Selected Messages, verse 3. She says, the woes of the law of a law. It was already starting in Gethsemane. She said, the woe of a lost world was falling on the Son of God. So in the end, what we know ultimately as individuals, what we know only as our pain is limited. As I said, no human being can suffer more than what any individual can suffer. But at the cross, I'm saying that Christ suffered corporately. Corporately, what we know only as individuals. So what I'm saying is that in the end, no human being, when it's all said and done, no human being is going to say, God, why did you create this world? Why did you create the world free? Why did I have to go through all this? How can you know anything about it? In the end, that's going to be stopped. That every mouth will be stopped, because no one is going to have suffered through it worse than God himself in the form of Jesus. So where have we been? Where have we been? God had no choice. If he wanted human beings to love him, he had to create them free. Okay? He had no choice. God cannot create beings that love him if they're not free. He had to create them free. He created us free, obviously knowing that sin would come, obviously knowing that there would be a fall, obviously knowing all this pain and suffering. But if he's an all-loving God, he did it ultimately because he's going to bring a greater good out of it. Ultimately, somehow it's all going to be justified, or God's ways are going to be justified. See, it's important. I've got another, the material in there is another sermon or a talk I gave one time in there. That was not the supplementary, where I deal with this question of theodicy. It's a word you ought to know. It's a word Adventists ought to know. It means the vindication of God in the face of evil. How could God be all loving and all good and there be evil? And we got to remember, theodicy is the justification of God, not the justification of evil. And there's a big difference. When it's all said and done, God is there's not going to be a justifying evil or explaining evil. What's going to be done is going to be a vindication of God's love and goodness in the face of evil. But so we say God had no choice. He had to create beings if they wanted to love Him. He created free beings. They made the wrong choice. Evil came into the world. God did it knowing it was going to happen, and ultimately He was going to bring a greater good out of it. He was going to have to ultimately vindicate His ways. But then the question is, how fair is that for God to have this great controversy, this battle between good and evil, while God is up in heaven, up there, the angels with Him in the glory of heaven, while us poor schnooks are down here struggling with what's going on. And I say the only answer, and it doesn't answer the question of all individual evil. I mean, I can't answer that. I'm not. In fact, that one talk in there, I question whether they really can ultimately be answered. We're going to get to heaven, I'm going to find out, Jesus, my wife was murdered and raped in front of me, and my daughter too. But now that I see how you've all worked it out for good, hallelujah, that was wonderful. I wouldn't have had it any other way. That's not what it's going to be. All things working together for good don't mean all things are good. But in the end, to the answer to that last question, well, how could God be up in heaven, up here, while all us schnooks down here are working through, that is answered by what Jesus did on the cross. Where on the cross, every bit of pain and suffering that we know only as individuals, and never more than as individuals, God felt it all corporately, suffered with us and for us in a way worse than any of us can ever or will ever suffer. And it doesn't fully answer Ivan Karamazov's question, the children, what can I do about them? It doesn't answer it fully. It doesn't really answer it in many ways. It just helps me to live with these unanswered questions, which for now is good enough. In fact, it's even for me now a little more than good enough.